To understand the man who would eventually turn the cold mathematics of the market into a global secular religion, one must first look at the gritty, crowded streets of Brooklyn in the early 1910s. Milton Friedman was born in 1912 to Jewish immigrants from what is now Ukraine. His parents, Sarah and Gino, were hardworking individuals who navigated the brutal realities of the American garment industry. This was an environment where economic theory wasn't something discussed in leather-bound books. It was a daily struggle for survival. The young Milton grew up in a household where every penny had a story of sweat and sacrifice behind it. This upbringing instilled in him a foundational belief that would define his life's work. Resources are scarce, and the individual is the best steward of their own destiny. Friedman was a polymath from a young age, possessing a mathematical mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. When he reached Rutgers University on a scholarship, he was initially torn between actuarial science and economics. However, the timing of his education was pivotal. He entered the academic world just as the Great Depression was ravaging the global landscape. While his peers looked at the breadlines and the shuttered factories and saw a failure of capitalism, Friedman saw something different. He began to suspect that the tragedy unfolding around him wasn't a natural byproduct of free trade, but rather a catastrophic failure of centralized management. Moving to the University of Chicago for his graduate studies, Friedman entered a lion's den of intellectual rigor. The Chicago School was not yet the global powerhouse it would become, but it was already a bastion of skepticism toward the growing trend of government intervention. Under the mentorship of giants like Jacob Viner and Frank Knight, Friedman sharpened his claws. He learned that for a market to be truly free, it required more than just the absence of taxes. It required a fundamental shift in how society viewed the role of the state. He began to formulate the idea that the invisible hand of Adam Smith was not just an antique metaphor, but a living, breathing mechanism that, if left unhampered, could solve the very problems the government was failing to fix. Friedman's early career was marked by a relentless pursuit of data. He wasn't interested in romantic notions of the public good, if they couldn't be quantified. He worked for the National Bureau of Economic Research, meticulously documenting the history of American income and consumption. It was during these years of quiet, intense study that the prophet of the market was forged. He was a man of small physical stature, standing barely 5 feet tall, but he possessed a voice that could pierce through the most complex bureaucratic jargon. He was preparing for a war of ideas, a decades-long crusade to dismantle the big government consensus that had dominated the post-World War II era. He saw himself as a David taking on the Goliath of the Keynesian establishment, armed not with a stone, but with a slide rule and an unshakable faith in the liberty of the individual. By the time he began teaching, Friedman had transitioned from a student of economics to a philosopher of freedom. He realized that to change the world, he couldn't just talk to other professors. He had to talk to the people. He had to convince the shopkeeper, the factory worker, and the housewife that their greatest enemy wasn't the greedy businessman, but the well-intentioned bureaucrat. This was the beginning of his journey to make the market a religion, a system of belief that prioritized the choice of the person over the plan of the state. To understand the intellectual bedrock of Milton Friedman's influence, one must look past his television appearances and into the dense, data-driven pages of his magnum opus, A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960, co-authored with Anna Schwartz. This work was not merely a history book. It was a forensic reconstruction of the American economy that sought to dismantle the reigning Keynesian orthodoxy of the mid-20th century. At the time, the consensus was that fiscal policy, government spending and taxation, was the primary lever for managing the economy. Friedman, however, proposed a radical alternative, monetarism. He argued that the most critical factor in economic stability was not how much the government spent, but the total amount of money circulating in the system. At the heart of this manifesto is the quantity theory of money, which Friedman revived and modernized. He expressed this through the fundamental equation MV equals PY. In this framework, M represents the money supply, V is the velocity, the rate at which money changes hands, P is the price level, and Y is the real goods and services produced, GDP. Friedman's revolutionary insight was his assertion that V, the velocity of money, is remarkably stable over long periods because it is determined by the ingrained habits of consumers and businesses. Therefore, if the central bank, M dollars, increases the supply of money faster than the economy can produce goods, Y dollars, the only possible result is a rise in prices, P dollars. This led to his most famous dictum: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. He argued that inflation was not caused by greedy corporations or powerful labor unions, but by a government that printed too much money to fund its own ambitions. Friedman applied this logic to the greatest economic catastrophe of the modern era, the Great Depression. While the Keynesians argued that the Depression was a failure of the animal spirits of the free market, Friedman provided a different culprit. He used decades of data to show that between 1929 and 1933, the Federal Reserve allowed the U.S. money supply to contract by an incredible one-third. By failing to provide liquidity to failing banks, the Fed turned a painful but routine recession into a decade-long collapse. To Friedman, this was the ultimate proof that human experts could not be trusted to manage the economy. Their ego and political pressures led to erratic, stop-go policies that created more instability than they solved. His solution was as cold and precise as a machine, the K% rule. He proposed that the Federal Reserve should be stripped of its discretionary power and replaced by a simple rule. The money supply should grow at a fixed, predictable rate, perhaps 3% to 5% per year, to match the long-term growth of the economy. By removing the human element, he believed the market would reach a natural equilibrium. This was the market as religion in its most technical form, a belief that the mathematical laws of supply and demand were superior to the fallible judgment of men. He didn't just want to fix the bank, he wanted to automate it, ensuring that the god of the market was never again silenced by the errors of a central planner. This shift in thought eventually led to the Volcker shock of the late 70s and early 80s, fundamentally changing how every central bank in the world operates today. In this section, we transition from the cold equations of monetarism to the moral heartbeat of Milton Friedman's worldview. If his economic theories were the how, his philosophy of choice was the why. For Friedman, the market was not merely a mechanism for the efficient distribution of goods and services, it was the ultimate expression of human dignity and personal agency. He believed that the ability to make one's own decisions, to succeed or fail on one's own merits, was the fundamental right that separated a free citizen from a subject of the state. This philosophy was most famously articulated in his book and television series, Free to Choose, which became the gospel for a new generation of libertarians and conservatives. At the core of this gospel was the belief that freedom is an indivisible whole. You cannot, Friedman argued, have political freedom, the right to vote, the right to speak, and the right to worship, without economic freedom. He saw the market as a daily democratic referendum. Every time a consumer spends $1, they are casting a vote for a specific product, a specific company, and a specific way of life. In contrast, a government program is a one-size-fits-all solution imposed by a majority, or a minority of bureaucrats, on everyone else. To Friedman, the market was the only system that allowed for unanimity without conformity. In a market, you can have your blue tie while I have my red tie. In a government system, we both get the tie the committee decided was fair for everyone. Friedman took this radical trust in the individual and applied it to the most sacred cow of the mid-20th century, the welfare state. He argued that government-run education, social security, and housing projects were inherently coercive and inefficient. His critique was not based on a lack of compassion, but on a different understanding of human incentives. He famously categorized the 4 ways to spend money: spending your own money on yourself, you're very careful about the cost and the quality; spending your own money on someone else, you are careful about the cost, but less so about the quality, like buying a gift. Spending someone else's money on yourself, you don't care about the cost, but you care a lot about the quality, like an expense account. Spending someone else's money on someone else, you don't care about the cost or the quality. Friedman argued that almost all government spending falls into the 4th category. This led him to propose the voucher system for education. He believed that if parents were given a voucher representing the money spent on their child's schooling, they could shop for the best school, public or private. This competition would force schools to improve or die out. He also proposed the negative income tax, a precursor to the universal basic income, which would give cash directly to the poor rather than trapping them in a bureaucratic maze of social workers and specific welfare requirements. By giving people money instead of services, he was returning to them the power of choice. However, this gospel of choice carries a heavy burden, the responsibility of failure. In Friedman's world, there is no safety net that doesn't also act as a cage. To be truly free to choose is to be free to make the wrong choice. This radical individualism is what turned his market logic into a religion. It required a leap of faith, a belief that the aggregate of millions of selfish, individual choices would somehow create a more moral and prosperous society than any planned effort to do good. He challenged the world to stop looking at the government as a benevolent parent and start looking at the market as a mirror of our own collective desires. It was a philosophy of cold liberty, where the invisible hand was the only God allowed in the temple of commerce. In the mid-1970s, Milton Friedman's religion moved from the chalkboards of Chicago to the rugged terrain of the Southern Cone. This chapter of his legacy is perhaps the most controversial, as it involves the intersection of pure economic theory and brutal political reality. The setting was Chile, a nation gripped by hyperinflation and political polarization under the socialist government of Salvador Allende. Following the bloody military coup in 1973, led by General Augusto Pinochet, a group of Chilean economists, known as the Chicago Boys, stepped into the power vacuum. These men had been trained at the University of Chicago under Friedman and his colleague Friedrich Hayek, and they were armed with a radical blueprint to dismantle the Chilean state and rebuild it in the image of the free market. The Chicago Boys implemented what Friedman called shock therapy. They believed that an economy as distorted as Chile's could not be fixed with gradual reforms. It required a sudden, total break from the past. They slashed government spending by 27% in a single year, privatized hundreds of state-owned companies, removed price controls, and opened the borders to unrestricted foreign trade. The goal was to strip away the safety nets that Friedman believed were actually hammocks of inefficiency. For the Chicago Boys, the market was a self-correcting deity that required a blank slate to function. However, this blank slate was being created under a military dictatorship that had abolished labor unions, censored the press, and was actively disappearing political dissidents. Friedman himself traveled to Santiago in 1975 to meet with Pinochet. In his lectures, he argued that the economic miracle of Chile would be the precursor to a political miracle. His logic was consistent with his gospel. You cannot have a free market for long without the people eventually demanding a free vote. He argued that by decentralizing economic power, the dictatorship was inadvertently sowing the seeds of its own demise. To his critics, however, this was a deal with the devil. They argued that Friedman's brand of capitalism was so unpopular that it could only be implemented at the point of a bayonet. The shock doctrine, as later coined by Naomi Klein, suggested that the market religion required a state of terror to force people to accept the loss of their social protections. The results of the Chilean experiment remain a subject of intense academic warfare. On one hand, the miracle of Chile is a statistical reality. By the 1980s, Chile's inflation had stabilized, and its GDP growth outpaced almost every other nation in Latin America. It became the poster child for neoliberalism, eventually transitioning back to a stable democracy in 1990. On the other hand, the social cost was immense. Poverty rates initially spiked, and the gap between the ultra-wealthy elite and the working class became a canyon. Friedman's laboratory proved that his theories could stabilize a crashing currency, but it also raised a haunting question that still lingers in global politics. Is the freedom of the market worth the suspension of human rights? Friedman remained unrepentant, viewing the Chilean success as a triumph of objective economic law over subjective political ideology. He saw himself not as a supporter of Pinochet, but as a doctor prescribing a bitter medicine to a dying patient. This period solidified his status as a global icon, but it also ensured that his religion would forever be associated with the Cold War power plays that redefined the borders of the 20th century. The Chicago Boys had proven that the market could be exported, but the price of that export continues to be debated in the streets of Santiago and the classrooms of Chicago to this day. In September 1970, Milton Friedman published an essay in the New York Times magazine that would act as a lightning bolt, shattering the traditional foundations of American business. The title was provocative and unambiguous. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. With this single document, Friedman effectively rewrote the moral code of the corporate world, birthed the era of shareholder primacy, and provided the market religion with its most controversial commandment. Before this intervention, the prevailing view, often called stakeholder capitalism, was that a corporation was a social institution. It was expected to balance the interests of its employees, its customers, to the local community and the nation at large. Friedman viewed this as a dangerous, subversive delusion. Friedman's argument was built on the principle of agency. He posited that a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business, the shareholders. Therefore, that executive has a direct responsibility to conduct the business in accordance with the owner's desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of society. When an executive spends company money on social goals, such as reducing pollution beyond what the law requires, or hiring the hardcore unemployed to fight poverty, Friedman argued they are essentially spending someone else's money. If the executive does this, they are effectively imposing a tax on the shareholders, the customers, or the employees, and then deciding how that tax money should be spent. To Friedman, this was taxation without representation, a fundamental violation of the democratic process. This doctrine transformed the soul of the corporation into a lean, profit-seeking machine. It gave rise to the efficiency movement and the rock star CEO of the 1980s and 90s, where success was measured exclusively by the quarterly earnings report and the stock price. The logic was that by focusing solely on profit, a company is forced to be as efficient as possible. An efficient company produces better goods at lower prices, creates more jobs through growth, and generates wealth that shareholders can then choose to donate to charity on their own. Friedman believed that if you want to save the world, you should do it with your own dividends, not by hijacking the machinery of production. He argued that when businesses try to play God by solving social ills, they usually end up being inefficient at business and incompetent at social work. However, the critics of this religion argue that this singular focus on profit created a moral vacuum. By ignoring externalities, the costs a company imposes on society that aren't reflected in its balance sheet, such as carbon emissions or the social decay caused by outsourcing, Friedman's doctrine allowed corporations to profit at the expense of the planet and the community. The pursuit of short-term shareholder value often led to the hollowing out of the American middle class, as companies slashed wages and benefits to maximize the next quarter's returns. It turned the corporation into an entity that had a legal personality but no conscience. Today, the business world is in the midst of a great schism. The rise of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, investing, and benefit corporations represents a direct rebellion against Friedman's ghost. Modern CEOs are once again being pressured to take stands on political issues, climate change, and social justice. Yet, even his harshest critics must admit that Friedman's clarity provided a necessary guardrail against corporate waste and greenwashing. He forced us to ask a difficult question. If a business isn't focused on profit, who is it really serving and who is holding it accountable? As we navigate a world of woke capitalism and global climate crisis, the tension between Friedman's profit-only mandate and the demand for corporate soul remains the central conflict of modern commerce. To walk through the halls of any major central bank, corporate boardroom, or treasury department today is to walk through a house that Milton Friedman built. Whether one views him as a liberator who freed the world from the stagnation of the 1970s, or as the architect of a cold, indifferent global order, his influence is inescapable. He did more than just win a Nobel Prize. He successfully shifted the Overton window, the range of ideas tolerated in public discourse, from a state-centered collective to an individual-centered market. However, as we move further into the 21st century, the religion of the market is facing a profound and multifaceted reformation. The world is no longer as certain as Friedman was that the invisible hand always knows best. The first major crack in the Friedmanite temple appeared during the 2008 financial crisis. For decades, the mantra of deregulation and market discipline had governed Wall Street. Friedman's disciples argued that banks, driven by the rational pursuit of profit, would never take risks that threatened their own existence. When the global economy nearly collapsed due to complex subprime mortgage derivatives, the world realized that markets are not always rational, and market discipline often arrives too late to prevent catastrophe. The massive government bailouts that followed were a direct refutation of Friedman's let-it-fail philosophy. It became clear that some entities had become too big to fail, creating a moral hazard that Friedman's theories in their pure form were unable to resolve without total systemic collapse. Furthermore, the gospel of choice is being reevaluated through the lens of extreme inequality. While Friedman's policies undoubtedly sparked a period of global growth and lifted hundreds of millions out of absolute poverty in places like China and India, the domestic results in Western nations have been polarizing. The great decoupling, where productivity continues to rise while real wages for the average worker remain stagnant, has led many to believe that the market's rewards are being captured exclusively by the top 1%. The populist surges of the 2020s, from both the political left and the right, represent a collective heresy against Friedman's globalist vision. People are once again demanding that the state protect them from the creative destruction of the market, calling for tariffs, industrial policy, and a return to the stakeholder model of the mid-20th century. Despite these challenges, Friedman's core insights remain hauntingly relevant and frequently proven correct. His warnings about the tyranny of the status quo and the inefficiency of bureaucracy still resonate every time a government project goes over budget or regulation stifles a small business. During the inflationary spikes of the early 2000s, policymakers were forced to return to his monetarist scriptures, realizing that pumping trillions into the economy without a corresponding increase in production does, indeed, lead to too much money chasing too few goods. We are discovering that while the market may not be a perfect god, the government is often an even more fallible one. The legacy of Milton Friedman is a world that is more efficient, more connected, and more competitive, but also more precarious and less certain of its social bonds. He stripped away the illusions of the nanny state and replaced them with the cold, bracing air of personal responsibility. As we navigate an era of AI-driven automation, climate change, and shifting geopolitical alliances, the debate he started in Brooklyn and Chicago continues. We are still trying to find the balance between the freedom to choose and the freedom from want. Friedman may have made the market a religion, but the 21st